Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to E2's webinar today, Performance Management in the Age of Compliance. My name is Cassandra, and I will be sharing with you tips and tricks that you can use to ensure that your performance management is compliant with Malaysian labor law. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we begin with the presentation, for all those who are joining us for the first time, there is a comment box or chat box where you can put your questions. After the presentation, I would try and answer as many Q&As as I can for about half an hour before we end today. Yeah, so just feel free to put anything in the comments, questions at any point of time. All right, so let's start. Just chat. Can everyone hear me very well? All good? Can you just let me know in the comments if you can hear me clearly? Great. Okay. When it comes to, as we all know, when it comes to termination of employment, employees and companies would need just cause and excuse. That could, whether it's poor performance, misconduct, retrenchment. And when it comes to poor performance, companies can have the best justification. It is so clear that an employee is underperforming. They have the evidence to say, like, hey, look here, this person is underperforming, we need to terminate them. But if they don't follow the correct process, it can be very costly. So I've seen so many companies where they come up to us and they say, look, it's very clear we have this person who's underperforming, whether it's constant underachievement through appraisals or repeated mistakes that affected the business operation of the company, or even continuous missed deadlines. But when the employee files the case at an industrial relations court under Section 20, within 60 days, the court will rule in favor of the employee because the company does not have things like strong documentation. Everything was verbally told, timelines were rushed, they even did not give a fair opportunity for the employee to improve. And this is what today is all about. How do we balance our performance management framework within the company to ensure that it's legally compliant, at the same time driving growth for our performance for employees, while ensuring that if it goes to court, the company is ever ready to justify and prove the termination due to poor performance. So one of the heavily disputed cases at the industrial court is based on poor performance. Why? Because it is so subjective. When it comes to misconduct, it is either the employee did something or they didn't do something. And that is based and backed up by evidence. But when it comes to performance, what company A thinks is good performance could just be an average performance for company B, who has higher standards of performance. So performance is very subjective. And when the case goes to court, the court is not looking into and would not evaluate what the employee's performance is actually like. Are they really underperforming? Are they actually an average performer? Or are they good performers? The courts will not scrutinize that. What the courts will scrutinize is whether the company was compliant. Did they follow due process? And the questions they will then ask would be, were the expectations in performance clearly communicated to the employee? Was the employee warned about the gaps in performance? Was reasonable time given? And if so, how much time? Was the employee aware of any coaching that is given, or do they understand even the coaching that is given? The courts will scrutinize that. So even if the employee was purely, genuinely, without a doubt, underperforming, but just because the company did not follow due process, for example, no documentations, no communication, no warnings, the court will normally rule in the employee's favor, which means we have seen companies paying thousands of ringgit to an employee who was clearly underperforming just because the company did not follow due process. So, valid reason, pure underperformance, wrong process. And when wrong process, I also mean sometimes they go on a disciplinary action instead of a performance management route, can sometimes lead to a very costly mistake. So one of the most common things that we see with companies is the fact that when the companies think about performance management, they think about, or they start running and become overly cautious with documentations, with warnings, with counseling when performance starts becoming an issue. So sometimes companies go full out when they know this person is underperforming. Termination is on the horizon. That's where we're heading. So we're just ensuring we have everything before we go there. So some companies do that. Other companies, what they do is they go as per usual business operations. And one fine day, the manager comes to HR and says, hey, look, I want to terminate this guy due to poor performance. Can you do that for me? And what they then try to do is they try to backtrack to see if they've met the legal requirements, or once the case is then filed in court, that's when they start panicking and say, hey, do we have everything that we need? And just to find out that it is insufficient. So effective and compliant performance management starts from the very beginning of the employment relationship, When that employee walks through the door, that is where you need to think about performance management. How are we shaping this performance? What framework do we have to ensure that it's compliant all the way? It's not when things are becoming an issue that's when you're putting everything in place. It's from the very beginning of the employee life cycle, which is what we will cover today. So, I would like you to imagine performance management like a pyramid, where the top of the pyramid is your outcomes of performance management, whether it is corrective actions for employees who are underperforming, whether it's reward systems for your top performers. And a pyramid is only as strong as its foundation. Similarly, your performance management system is only as strong as its foundation. And what do I mean by foundation? Foundation would means what are the documentations you have in place? What are your performance framework system that you have in place from the very beginning of the employee's life cycle that brings you to the point at the top of the pyramid? Is it strong enough? So we'll start off with the employment contract, the basis of the legal relationship between the company and the employee. Now, an employment contract is part and parcel of the performance management system, simply being it sets out the position. Some of them set out the roles and responsibilities of that position, and some companies even include the job description in it. And what we mean by a strong foundation is that from the employment contract itself, I, as an employee, know what position I am very clearly. I know what roles and responsibilities that I need to do very clearly. And if there's a JD in it, a job description in it, I know what my responsibilities are. So the employment contract then, as I said, leads to the job description, which is it sets out the core responsibilities of the employee in that role. So imagine if you have a very vague JD. Let's say I'm a technician in a company and the JD just says fix elevators. That's it. How do you then, or even let's say fix elevators and produce reports? So what reports are you talking about? Sorry. What reports are you talking about? How often do I need to produce these reports? What, when do I do it? Who do I do it for? Who is meant to be the audience for my reports? So the vague JDs then leads to vague KPIs. So KPIs would be your measurable goals. They are translating your core responsibilities into measurable goals that the employees can measure what success looks like. So if you have a vague JD, then that brings you to a bit difficult to justify your KPIs, right? And imagine if you have very vague KPIs like improve customer satisfaction. How do I do that? What are you talking about? Means if I improve customer satisfaction by 1%, is that sufficient? So if your foundations are not strong, your job descriptions, your KPI, your employment contracts, then that makes performance goals very difficult. That makes your further actions after performance appraisals, like counseling or corrective action, or even starting the managing poor performance process, very difficult. So it's all interlinked. Just like a pyramid, your performance management system is only as strong as its foundation. And when you have a strong foundation, when you ensure that all these other documents in the employee's life cycle are clear, are definite, are strong enough, that makes performance management easier. It makes everything in compliance. And not only that, it drives performance growth because everyone is clear on what they need to do. which then brings us to expectations. So, another part of the foundation is setting clear expectations from the beginning. So, we talk about the performance foundation, and one of the key, or I wouldn't say key, I would say core causes, one of the major causes of poor performance, if you talk about in performance management, is not normally the employee's capability. It is confusion. Half of the time, when employees go to court, or even when you're talking about unfair dismissal claims, is that employees are not sure of what they're supposed to do. Employees are not sure what to perform, what success looks like. They get the JD, they get their KPI, off they go, and they're lost on how success would be measured. They're lost on the direction they need to go. So if you start with the role clarity, if you ensure that employees understand from the very beginning their job scope, responsibilities, reporting lines, which are so critical in performance management, this will then help you with your business growth. There is compliance because companies can say, look, from the very beginning, we made sure that employees knew what they were supposed to do. They cannot then say, I didn't know what was expected of me, because from the very beginning, not when performance becomes an issue, from the very beginning, expectations were discussed. So a lot of companies sometimes use JD as just a recruitment tool during onboarding. Here's the role you want to apply for, here's the JD. But JD is not only a recruitment document, it is a performance management tool. It's one of the key things that employees will then rely on to say, no, it's not part of my JD. And that's when company gets stuck, because if your JD is so vague and you want to push further for performance growth, align with the business direction, you want to push for better performance, saying, hey, you're underperforming, most of the time the employees will then come back and say, look, it's not part of my JD. And then you're stuck, even though it's part and parcel of that role, because your JD was not clear. So setting clear expectations from the beginning, very important in terms of documentation and expectations during onboarding. Now, even at the beginning, we're also looking at manager and employees' expectations. Now, most of the time, especially when I do training, managers will come and tell me they should know what they're supposed to do, or they should know whether they're doing a bad job or not. Now, let me ask you very frankly, if I'm doing a job and I'm doing it the way I think I'm supposed to do it, and my manager or my superior doesn't say anything about it, I would assume I'm doing a good job, or I would assume that I'm doing okay, even if it's not a great job. But my manager thinks otherwise. My manager thinks, hey, this person should be better, but no feedback is given. No comments or gaps are highlighted. That's when misalignment starts. Misalignment starts not only when issues start arising, but from the very beginning, when managers don't take the time to say, hey, this is what I expect from you. And the employee just interprets whatever KPI or GD that they have and do the job accordingly. That's when misalign happens. And when misalign happens and nobody addresses it, nobody, I would even say, brings it up, then it leads to performance issues later on that needs to be curbed. So communication, clear expectations from the very beginning, setting the foundation very strong from the very beginning of the employment life cycle goes a long way in performance management. So after talking about your JD, your roles and responsibilities, your expectations, then we go to the next level in the foundation, which is your KPIs, right? Where you're translating what the job scope is, what the roles and responsibilities are, to measurable goals. Means what we're saying is, here's your JD, this is what your responsibilities are, here's your KPI, this is how you're going to achieve it. This is how we measure success. This is my baseline to say that you're performing or you're not. Now, most of the time, KPIs are forgotten. They do if every year I need to set in my own KPIs, I'll just do it. Managers like, okay, lah, right? And half of the time it's very vague. Now, when you talk about measuring success, the baseline of what is a good performance or not, you need to ensure that your KPIs follow the SMART principle, right? Which means it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So, what we mean is simply this: SMART principles has to be specific. Your KPI has to be very specific. So, imagine if it's a salesperson, employee who's doing client relationships, and the KPI is improve customer satisfaction. How is that specific? What do you mean? Do you mean generally, or is there a specific thing that you want me to do? So, improve customer satisfaction. How do you measure it? KPI has to be measurable. Is it achievable? Is it too general that I don't know what I'm supposed to achieve? So, if you're talking about a quarter KPI review or an annual KPI review, is the KPI set achievable for within that year, right? Can I realistically achieve it? And what is the time period that I have to achieve it? So that is a SMART goal. So if you compare, let's say, improve customer satisfaction, which is a very vague KPI that does not go with the SMART principle, compared to improve customer satisfaction by 90% of positive feedbacks within 6 months. That would be a KPI within the SMART principle. And a lot of times, more companies practice this now, but a lot of times the KPI is not used based on SMART principle and it leaves things very vague. It doesn't even align with individual goals, with department and business outcomes. So you're looking at managing performance on an individual basis, but you're not linking it to where the business needs to go, especially if it's vague. So when you do your KPIs, number one, you need to ensure that they're specific enough because that would be your baseline. And when you are specific according to the SMART goals and use it as a baseline, it allows performance appraisals to be objective, which means if I say that, hey, you're underperforming, and the employee says, how? You can say, oh, you didn't reach 90%. If you don't have a specific goal or KPI, and you say, hey, you're underperforming, employee asks, how? And you say, because I said so, or because it's my evaluation, it becomes very subjective. And that's when biasness may also creep in. So having very objective goals will then allow the company to be compliant in the process because you would have satisfied the requirement of, did the employee know what is expected of them? Yes, we do. We have very clear KPIs, which will then be used as evidence at the industrial court. And when you align individual goals with departmental or business outcomes as well, employees will understand the bigger picture. They will know what they need to achieve to drive the performance forward. So that is also something that will then help drive business growth, but at the same time manage compliance for the company. And finally, if a KPI is agreed and documented according to the SMART principle for both employee and manager, that drives accountability. That is then used as the benchmark for all performance management moving forward, whether it's on a yearly basis, quarterly basis, half year basis, it doesn't matter because they are going to refer back to this KPI, which is why it's so crucial to ensure that this foundation is strongly set by ensuring that you don't have fake KPIs. So, moving forward from KPI, so we have our JDs, our strong foundation, followed by the KPI, which is another top part of the strong foundation. Now we go to communication. Half of the time, when employees go to court, there are two things that will always cause a company to lose: insufficient documentation, evidence, and insufficient communication. Employees will say, I don't know what happened. I don't know why they say I'm underperforming. Nobody told me anything. Now, when you talk about good performance management, it is not only crucial to say what you should do or you should not do. A lot of times when we do performance appraisals, companies will say, managers will say, oh, you can improve on this. You didn't do this. You should back up on this. But they don't explain what good performance look like. They do not explain what expectations they have on what performance should be. They always highlight the gaps, which is good. But when you want to drive performance further, you should also highlight the direction that you want them to go. And we're not saying to spoon feed them and say, hey, you need to achieve A, B, and C to be a good performer. But what we're saying is communicate enough to give them tangible expectations to ensure that they reach performance and push them for a further growth. So reinforce that performance will be assessed objectively. You go back to then your KPIs. So if, for example, an employee comes up to your managers and they say, hey, what do you think a top performer will be like? KPIs will be your baseline. And then that's when you communicate what the company's expectations would be. So communicate the standards of practice. That is when you're managing performance. It is not when performance becomes an issue and then you're highlighting all your gaps, but more of this is what we expect to drive growth from the very beginning. And it also should set the tone for accountability and cultures. When we're talking about foundations, other than your documentation to be specific, clear, and moving forward, communication, we're also talking about tone. When we're talking about tone for accountability and support, we're actually talking about culture. So performance management in the age of compliance is not so much of ticking legal checkboxes, but changing your culture. How do we ensure that we're compliant from the very start? But at the same time, what are we doing right to ensure that we're driving the performance growth to where we need to be? And most of this is a two-way process between your managers and your employees. So most often than not, a very common practice is you have your annual appraisals and your annual KPIs, where these discussions are boiled down to once a year. I highlight what I need to highlight. You're not doing this. You didn't achieve this. This is your scale of your rating, and moving forward. But most often not. In between, the ball drops. In between, managers don't address issues as they arise. They wait until it becomes a major issue, and then you're putting someone on a PIP. But regular feedback and support, building that culture that transparency and accountability drives performance, is what you should aim to do. Which means that if I am having regular feedbacks along the way, whether it is the challenges employees face, whether it is minor gaps that I can address by just a communication session, it builds performance, it addresses issues from the very beginning. And what happens when this person truly cannot perform and you're looking at termination, you would have all the documentation that you need from the very beginning. You're not backtracking, you're not scrambling, looking for evidence to support. You already have a structured system that allows you to build your case and allows you to tell the court, look, we've done all of this, we've communicated, we've given feedback, and this, unfortunately, the employee was still not underperforming. So you're creating a culture which is on a daily basis that is also ensuring compliance along the way. So if I could sum up the whole performance management, it boils down to two things: communication and documentation. The two pillars in performance management to ensure compliance, the two pillars that drives performance growth, whether it's pushing them to become top performers, whether it is addressing them as they go, whether it is highlighting gaps in performance. Communication and documentation are your two pillars. They don't change. Most of the time, as I mentioned before, why employers fail and in the court is not because the employee was performing, is not because their evaluation was wrong, is because they do not have enough communication or documentation to prove to the court that it is due process. So when you talk about due process, which we will cover a bit after this, we're talking about the legal requirements that the court has to say that fair opportunity was given. Hence, yes, the company is justified to terminate this person due to poor performance. So communication is the key when we talk about performance management. We're talking about setting expectations in the beginning. We're talking about regular feedbacks. We're talking about identifying and addressing gaps as they go along. Those are all communication. Even when you're managing underperformance, you're setting expectations. You're saying that, hey, this is where you need to be. That is communication. This is what you're doing wrong. This is how we can help you. Those are all good, clear communication. That's the first pillar. It's throughout the process. It's very different from misconduct, whether someone did something or not. Do we have the evidence? This is a journey that starts from the very beginning that requires a lot of communication both ways. Documentation is what you would need to have to show the court that, hey, we followed due process. We've highlighted gaps, that's documented. We've given warnings, that also has been documented. And we've also have done all of this to assist the employee to improve their performance, which is also documented. Most of the time, especially for courts, if you do not document all these things that you've done throughout, it is as like it didn't happen. It would seem that the company cannot prove what has happened. So for example, very simply, you say as managers or as the company, you say, look, we've highlighted certain gaps, but it was verbal. The employee acknowledged it, and hence we moved on, right? And you want to show the court and you want to tell the court, look, we've reminded about this gap so many times. We've given multiple verbal warnings, but unfortunately, there was no documentation. All it takes is for the employee to go to court to say, no, the company hasn't told me anything. I didn't know. And what happens then? The company's then hands are then tied because you have nothing to prove. You have nothing to show other than, let's say, a manager's testimony and the employees. It's a he say, she say situation. And you have nothing to say or show that warnings were actually given. These things were highlighted. It was communicated. We've discussed this. You have nothing to show of that sort. So that is why communication and documentation are your two pillars in performance management to ensure compliance. You don't need so much of forms. You don't need a proper processes. If a simple email would do, if you have checkpoints on your system, company system or company portal, that would also suffice. All you need to ensure is We spoke about it. Hey, here's the summary. It's documented. And this will also benefit performance management in the long run because both employee and managers can then refer back to that same document to say, hey, we spoke about this before, yet you have not improved. What are your challenges? What can we do moving forward? Right? So always remember or even ensure that your company practices communication and documentation when it comes to performance management. Now, why having the right communication methods? So we spoke about the two pillars, but why is it important? Number one is it is not just a soft skill, it's a legal safeguard. So when I talk about communication, I'm not saying that, hey, it's just good practice. It is best practice to ensure that everything is communicated from the start. It's a legal safeguard for the company. And if you practice it from the very beginning, you're just complying and making your life so much more easier at the end of the day. The courts often scrutinize whether the company gave the employee a fair chance to understand and rectify performance issues. So we're talking about when performance becomes an issue, you're doing your warnings, you're identifying your gaps, whether they understand. But if you practice communication as a legal safeguard from the very beginning, when you start work, your job description, your KPIs, your goals, all of this builds your story. It starts with communication, right? And as I said before, failure to communicate properly often results in dismissal being deemed unfair, even though the employee was genuinely underperforming. And as I also mentioned before, communication also prevents confusion. You communicate, you clarify, it prevents confusion. So, one of the most common reasons, like I said, they don't know what is expected of them. So, they go to court, they say, I didn't know I was supposed to do this. Or not only that, sometimes because as business develops, goalpost shifts, these things are then not communicated to the employees. So if you want them to improve performance, you want them to take on more tasks, or you want them to improve, focus on this task even better, all of these are not communicated. So whether it is about KPIs, deadlines, right? You want something faster, you want something longer, all of these are not communicated and it prevents confusion. I mean, it has confusion, right? If you put yourself in employee shoes and your boss tells you A today, tells you B tomorrow, tells you C on Wednesday, and then at the end of the day, you don't know exactly what the boss wants, and you go up to them and you say, hey, what exactly do you want me to do? And they say, you should know. Why are you in this position if you don't know? That's when underperformance starts. That's when performance issues arise. That's when culture gets affected. So clarity prevents confusion. Set the benchmark, be clear about the benchmark that you need, and that can minimize many performance issues as you move along the way. So, what is required of the company when an employee starts underperforming? So, the law is very clear on this. There are three things that the company has to prove for a case of underperformance in the industrial court, which is that the employee was warned of the poor performance or the gaps in performance, that the employee was given sufficient opportunities to improve, and despite the sufficient opportunities to improve, the employee failed to improve sufficiently despite the opportunities presented. So this has been very clear. Now, what you will need to remember is, even though it's very simple, warning, given sufficient opportunity, failed despite the opportunity, there are other things that you would need to fulfill. So one is, when you mean by warning, what do you mean by warning? Does it simply mean that, hey, you're not performing, please back up? The law has also put on the fact that when the employee is warned about the poor performance, ideally, number one, it should be writing, documentation, one of the pillars, but it should also highlight the weak areas of the employee. Means that you're identifying the gaps where you think it's going wrong and the expectations that you want them to be, right? So the weak areas, so for example, you're not producing enough quotations per week. What were the expectations based on the KPI? You need to produce 10 quotations in a week. You're only doing 5. And what is the time frame you're going to give them to improve? Means if it's a weekly basis, okay, I give you 1 month to reach at least a consistent 10 quotations every week before we reassess. This is how you give a warning. This is how you train your managers to say, talk about this, put this in writing. This can then be used for compliance and evidence later on. And this, after the warnings, and you want to give the opportunity comes in terms of timing. How much time is enough? This is where compliance meets practicality. Are we practical enough to be given this amount of time, taking into account of business needs? At the same time, is this reasonable enough to be compliant with what the law requires? So the law, unfortunately, does not state a very specific time frame to show improvement. It is not simple as 7 weeks, 7 days, 1 month. They use the term reasonable. So what is reasonable? Reasonable depends on the nature of the job. Compare a technical expert who requires months to understand the system or requires months to do the job, compared to a salesperson who has a quota to meet every week. So a reasonable time frame for both would be, if I have my KPI or my goals every week, a shorter time frame would be sufficient to show that the company has given me reasonable time to improve, compared to a technical expert who needs months on a project and your KPI or your goals are measured on, let's say, a 6-month basis, then you would need to give this technical expert a longer time to improve because the nature of the job is as such. So that is one of the factors that the courts or the company can even look into. The next is the severity of the underperformance. For example, if your salesperson, for example, the underperformance is just that my quota is 10 quotations a week, I'm doing 8. So there's a slight gap there. That could be a reasonable time frame because you just need a smaller gap to finish, right? A smaller gap to get them to where they need to be, compared to a really underperformance where they're doing only 1 quotation a week. So you're going through the root cause. You're going through why are you underperforming so badly? Do you need more time? So the severity of the underperformance is also something that you should take into account when deciding the time frame. Another way to look at severity of underperformance is is it only a certain angle? So let's say out of 10 KPIs, I'm only have gaps for 1, compared to employee B who has 5 or 6 gaps based on the KPIs, right? Or 5, 6 KPIs that are not meeting targets or not meeting goals. So that would then require a different time frame. Third, the impact on business operations. Now, when we talk about reasonable time frame, we're not saying that the companies would have to allow the employees time to improve indefinitely. Because ultimately, if someone is not performing, that will also affect business operations. That's when you would have to strike a balance. That's when judgment comes in to strike a balance on how much time are we giving to this person, to this employee to improve, which is fair, comparatively to how is it affecting the business? How long more can we allow this person to go on till it affects the business? So if it's affecting the business very majorly that you need this person out to get someone in, document it, have that communication, put that in writing so that can then be used as evidence to justify to the court why this period of time was given to the employee. So that's how you balance practicality with compliance and you strike the right balance. Another one that we talk about is the learning curve, right? Based on the job role. So, for example, we go back to a salesperson who has daily or weekly tasks where the learning curve is on a shorter period compared to a technical expert where the learning curve is on maybe on a 6 month period. That also plays a role in striking the balance between what is reasonable opportunity and balancing it with business and operation needs. So, is PIP necessary? PIP is not mandatory by law. However, it is a strongly, highly encouraged process because it allows the company to prove that they have met the legal requirements. So, for example, think of it as a bridge from underperformance to termination. All right. So, a PIP shows the court that you have given clear expectations, you have highlighted the performance, right? That's also in the PIP. You have given them a reasonable time to improve. That's the duration of the PIP. And despite the time given, and despite all the opportunities given, which also includes the coaching methods that you include in the PIP, the employee has failed to improve. That is your outcome from the PIP. So in the PIP document alone, that helps you to tell the court, look, we've met all the legal requirements. Here's the document, the PIP process. But even before the PIP process, throughout the whole employee cycle, we have been communicating regularly. And then this will put the company in a very compliant and strong position to justify why performance improvement plan is necessary, right? So, or why the termination was done, or why the journey to the point that it has become a PIP and the company has decided to terminate the employment, you can show everything. It's like an audit track. This is why, and PIP is your final piece of the puzzle. So, in the case of Sharifa against Petrofac, this is what the court said about PIP. From the evidence adduced, it was clear and credible that the company had given the claimant adequate notice and warning of her unsatisfactory performance and alerted her to the mistakes she had made. The company had also given the claimant sufficient time to improve herself. By initiating the PIP, the company had shown that it was serious in helping the claimant improve on her performance, and the fortnightly meetings were sufficient to help the claimant to raise issues and receive guidance and help. So, from this case, you can see that the court relies on the PIP to also ensure that due process has been followed. So, this would be, even though it is not recommended, not required by law, it's not mandatory by law, but it is highly recommended for companies to practice PIP as part of your performance management system. So, what makes a PIP fair and defensible? What would you need to ensure that your PIP is on point and meets all the legal requirements? Clear performance gaps based on evidence. You have your warnings in the beginning, you have your KPIs, which is the measurable goals that you need to reach, and you can clearly identify performance gaps and you can show the performance gaps with evidence. So that is your PIP. One side of it, performance gaps by the employee. You would also need to put in what is expected. So what is the goals that you're supposed to reach based on that gaps? That will also be included in the PIP. You would need to that's your specific measurable goals. What would the employee need to achieve in the PIP to overcome the performance gaps? You would also need to have specific timelines. Now, a general PIP is about 3 months, as recommended by the court. But within that 3 months, you would also need to tell the employee, if you have different tasks, what are the timelines for those tasks specifically. Let's say task A is a weekly task that you need to achieve. Task B can be a monthly task that you need to achieve. So all of this would have to be mentioned in the PIP as well. You would also need reasonable support. What kind of guidance are you giving? What kind of resources are you using to help the employee improve the performance? What is the coaching, whether it's mentorship, whether it's weekly reviews, whether it is monthly reviews, all of that is communicated. Where can they go to find help, right? You need to have periodic reviews. It is not one communication at the beginning of PIP and one communication at the end to see if they pass or they fail. It is a periodic review with written feedback. You need to document any employee's response or progress throughout. And you also need to tell them what is the consequence if there's no improvement or communication upfront, which means that you don't improve, what are the possibilities? Whether it is extension, whether it's termination, demotion, transfer, whatever it is, you need to be very clear on the communication in the beginning. Now, what are the consequences or what are common pitfalls when it comes to PIP? One of the things is using PIP as a termination checklist. The point of the PIP is to improve employees' performance. It is to ensure that the goal is I'm doing all this. It's like an intensive coaching, intensive training for you to improve your performance. It is not a checklist to get you out. So a lot of companies tend to do this as a checklist to get them out rather than to help them to achieve. And so what they do is they set really high targets, or they set very vague targets, or they talk about behavioral issues which you cannot measure, right? There are some PIP that talks about, oh, you need to be more initiative. How? What do you mean by initiative? If I ask one question a day, is that initiative enough? So it's so vague, and then that comes a common pitfall in which leads to an unfair process. So these are the things that companies have to bear in mind when you're actually vetting through a PIP. Let's say you're HR and part of your job is to vet through PIP that is done by the managers. This is what you need to look out for. Is it clear enough? Do they understand? What are the expectations? Are they specific enough? Is there clear timelines? So these are the things that you have to look into, especially when you're vetting a PIP as HR. Now, as a summary, before we end, when we talk about performance management framework, which is already very compliant, that also drives growth in performance, set clear expectations from the very beginning, not only in PIP, but from the very beginning of an employee's life cycle, which is the JD, measurable and documented KPIs, which follows the SMART goals, monitor performance, and we're talking about regular feedback every month, every quarter, half a year. We're not only talking about once a year situation, which is then the feedback also follows with documentation, identifying gaps. So going through what are the gaps and correcting it as it happens, not when it becomes a very big issue. Another thing is if I've been doing this for 6, 7 months and the manager is only highlighting now saying, hey, we're going to put you on a PIP because you've been doing this wrong for 6, 7 months. Why was this not communicated earlier? You could save a lot of time in performance management if you could have an employee who knows that this is something that can be changed, and if they changed it, that saves you a lot of trouble, right? So intervene early, coaching or informal discussions, formal process in the PIP, structured opportunity for improvement, not a checklist for termination, and your final review, which is you're looking at things very objectively because you have all the measurables in place that will allow things to be objectively evaluated. And we also want to talk about other things that would then help performance management in compliance, which is when you're managing performance and you're not looking at documentations for compliance, sometimes performance issues are not so much on capability or communication, but more what is the root cause? Is it motivation? Is it the workload? Is it a mismatch of skills to the role? And that can prevent things from going all the way to PIP. Identifying root causes. What is the root cause of this person underperforming? Sometimes it can be personal reasons, sometimes it can be culture in the company, right? So these are things that will then allow HR and the managers to manage performance a little bit more differently. And as I repeatedly said throughout today, communicate clearly, avoid vague terms, be very clear in what you need to address, support, don't accuse. Don't look at performance as something that an employee has done wrong. What is it that's causing them to underperform? How can we support it? If we truly have done everything, then by all means, yes, termination is part of it. But can we mentor it? Can we train? Do we need to send them from training? Is it a gap in skills that can be overcome through training? Review progress, and only when all of this is exhausted. If there is no improvement, even with PIP, you look at termination as the very last resort. Now, I will go through your questions in a bit, so please feel free to ask as many questions as you want. But before that, I would like to highlight our retainer program for all of those who are not our members as of yet. Now, our retainer program is designed to provide your organization with continuous expert support in industrial relations. So questions like, Cassie, is this performance management framework okay? Is my PIP okay? Am I missing something? Do I need to add something in? Is it specific enough? All of this are services that we provide under our retainer. We also review PIP plans. We train on performance management. So please take a look at our retainer program, which you can contact any one of us or even find our retainer deck online on our website and consider it for our services, which is advisory throughout the year on a daily basis, unlimited, together with free review of documents like show cause letters, PIP plans, termination letters, and so on and so forth. And that is all from me. So we're going to go through the questions now. Yeah? Okay. First question. What if after the PIP has been carried out, the PIP panel finds that the employee does not need to proceed to step 3, the final stage, because the employee has already shown improvement and the department head is also satisfied? The issue is that top management disagrees and insists on continuing the PIP until the final stage, which will take a long time and seem like a waste of time. unless the employee has shown no improvement at all. Here, I would recommend that there's two things. One, if the employee has already shown improvement and department head is also satisfied, you can end the PIP, but I would recommend that you finish it. Simply being because if it's a 3-month process and you're only looking at another month, for example, having that person just doing the work for another month under PIP and the company has complied to the duration of time that is given, that would then strengthen the company's position should the company decide to take any further action later on because you complied with the PIP duration. Now, I understand that it's a lot of work. It may feel like a waste of time, but it is better to have a complete PIP, even though the employee has shown improvement, because those are all data. So, for example, if I have already shown improvement 50%, but the last month I went up 80%, that would not be a data that you would have should the PIP end early. So you can do so if you want, but I would very highly recommend for you to finish the PIP duration as set by the company in the beginning. The second question, what does a well-structured performance improvement plan looks like and what key elements should it include? So as I said before, a well-structured performance improvement plan is the structured goals. You have your gaps, you have your specific goals that you are given, the task, you have a time period for them to achieve every single task that they have. And you have the outcomes. So you measure it on a monthly basis with periodic reviews. What is the progress? Have they achieved it? Have they not? What needs to be done? You also need your coaching, guidance. How do I achieve someone? How do I achieve this task within the time period? And you also need to tell them what are the consequences should they not pass the PIP. Is it permissible to terminate an employee who fails to meet expectations during probation without implementing a performance improvement plan? Yes, it is, because for probationers, a performance improvement plan is not necessary. The courts have stated that you still need to highlight the gaps. You need to communicate your expectations or where they are lacking. But if you have your feedbacks throughout probation, so for example, if you have your monthly feedbacks throughout probation and that is documented, that is sufficient enough to, I would say, sufficient enough to justify a non-confirmation of employment. The next question. In what ways can compliance be leveraged as a tool to enhance performance rather than restrict it? This would go back to your performance management framework. So compliance here is not ensuring that everything is legally, I would say legally proved. It doesn't have to be very legal in terms of words and so on and so forth. But compliance can be leveraged as a tool to ensure, especially when you talk about communication and documentation. When you talk about ensuring that my performance management framework has a daily basis of ensuring things are documented as it goes along, that's already a compliant action, but that leverages it as a performance tool because it drives accountability. It sets a benchmark where employees and managers can then refer to those conversations to show the growth and to show progress and how it moves forward. So that is how I would say a compliant action or a compliant practice can then be leveraged to move or drive performance growth. What are some effective KPIs or metrics that balance both compliance adherence and performance outcomes? This will go back to your SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, time bound. That's already compliant adherence, and it drives performance outcomes because the employee knows exactly what they need to achieve that KPI. Next question. What advice would you give HR professionals to future-proof their performance systems in the age of compliance? My advice would be to initiate a culture or ensure a culture, even grow a culture where managers practice documentation. Most of the times they are clear on SMART goals, they are clear on communication, but they tend not to document those things. They tend not to put in a simple email summary, or even if you have your systems in your portals, they lack in that area. So that's one thing that I think HR can initiate as a culture to ensure compliance, especially when you want to justify termination. Next question. Are there patterns in performance ratings that could suggest potential discriminatory or biased practices? So, this would be when your performance ratings are very subjective, where there is no objective goals for managers to refer to for performance appraisals. So, for example, if let's say you have a team of sales people or sales team, and you don't have SMART goals, you don't have specific KPIs that managers can then use to evaluate performance, and your JD or KPIs is improve customer satisfaction, ensure attendance, or vague things like reach sales target. That's when you have an opening for biased evaluation, because it is based on managers' subjective evaluation of how they interpret the KPIs, and that can even differ among the team members in the same team. So, for example, if I am bringing in 20 units per month and my team member brings 25 units per month, and then they don't, and the manager says, "Oh, you're underperforming because you didn't meet the rest of the KPIs." How is that? Where it's 5 units difference. Why am I a poor performer and he's not? Where is the line, the boundary? That's when it can suggest biasness in your evaluation. Next question. Can we terminate the probationer after monthly review? PIP was done once, then can terminate the staff already. So when it comes to probationers, you have to adhere to the probation period that has been agreed by the company and the employee. You don't have to do a PIP, it is not necessary, but you do need to give feedback and warnings. So communication and documentation is very important. So if you do after a monthly review and the employee is not meeting the expectations of the company, yes, you can non-confirm the employee. If let's say PIP was done even during probation and there was no sufficient improvement, you can. If there was some sufficient improvement, I would then advise on maybe considering an extension. If this, let's say a permanent employee, if PIP was done once, then can we terminate? Yes, you can if there was no sufficient improvement. If there was a slight improvement where the employee can argue that some improvement was made, then the company may need to consider, do we extend, or is it sufficient enough for termination? Next question. How can HR help managers see compliance not as a burden, but as a support for better decisions? What measures can HR take to audit the quality of performance feedback, not just completion rates? So I think this comes with training. This comes with managers understanding why compliance is necessary, and to see the benefits that when it comes to documentation, benchmarking, accountability, that may then get them to understand why this matters, especially documentation. When you talk about quality of performance feedback, it is more of teaching them what are the things that they need to highlight. So half the time when managers don't have the training in performance management, they think that if I just put down completion rates, that is sufficient. But they don't understand the law's requirements on what warnings are needed. How do we warn? They don't need that. They don't understand that when we talk about performance feedback, it is not so much of just saying what you've done, what you've not done. It's highlighting the gaps and telling them what the expectation of the company is, identifying if there's any challenges that can be that can be addressed even without a performance issue, right? Which is part of performance management. So I think how can HR help managers see compliance as a support and even look into the quality of performance feedback starts off with training. And unfortunately, the measures, once with the training, you will need to do a bit of checking here and there. And that only comes with awareness. Next question. How do we ensure fair PIP as a HR, and how do we communicate with manager on this PIP? So a lot of companies practice where HR runs through or reviews the PIP to ensure it's compliant. So that's one thing that you as a HR means you have the understanding of what PIP entails, what is required in terms of compliance, and you're doing awareness for your manager to say that, look, this task is acceptable, this is not specific enough, this has to have a timeline. So that is one way you can assist the managers. Again, I think when it comes to managers, it has to go a lot on training, a lot on awareness. They need to also be trained on how to do performance management and to have that skill to then manage their team effectively. Next question. If appraisal is done through system, can you share some interventions that can be taken up by HR to ensure individual is aware of their final assessment prior taking up to the next level? So usually if it's done through a system, which means, some companies get the employees to evaluate first and the managers to evaluate thereafter, I think setting up a communication session between the manager and the employee would help them to be aware of their final assessment. That's one. Or number two, if let's say you have a system where the company is a bit too big to do these kind of things, you can also always set a reminder in the system for them to look at their final assessment and to have any communication thereafter with the manager should they require to do so. I think that will then assist and to mitigate any complaints that, I didn't know what my final assessment was. Next question. What is HR's realistic involvement in performance management? Checking, because oftentimes HR refuse to get involved until the issuance of termination letter, and even that HR refuses to sign the termination letter unless co-signed by the head of department. HR's realistic involvement really depends on what the company decides the HR's role to be. But I believe that if the HR is equipped to understand the whole performance management process, they are a support system for managers. Because performance management is usually driven by managers. They are the one that knows the gaps. They're the ones that set the KPIs. They're the ones that approve the KPIs. And they are also the ones that know their team better than anyone else. And HR is that support system at the back that can sometimes drive the performance should the company require them to do so, but it's more of a check and balance system, in my opinion. It has to be both ways. Performance management cannot fall on the shoulders of HR alone. neither can it fall on the manager's head alone as well. They need to support each other to ensure a more compliant and efficient performance management system. Next question. Let's say that they set for staff to achieve in PIP, percentage-wise is 90%. And we conduct 3 phases of PIP. The first phase, the staff achieve 85%. And steadily, there is a slight increase in every phase. Phase 2, 87%. And last phase, 88%. So there is improvement, but still on all the 3 phases, the staff did not achieve the target set, even though it is only 2% different in the final phase. Can the company still dismiss the staff due to poor performance? In this scenario, I would advise the company to extend the PIP for them to see whether there's further improvement, whether they can reach 90%. If even upon the extension, the employee cannot show any more improvement, then yes, you can dismiss. If you dismiss at this point, we have to remember that PIP is used to improve performance and not a termination checklist. So here the employee can argue that there was improvement, and since there's only a 2% difference, it may feel that the company was not giving the employee a sufficient and fair opportunity to improve. That there was some improvement, company still decided to terminate. So if you extend the PIP, and even in the extension, the employee cannot achieve 90%, that will then give a stronger ground for the company to dismiss due to poor performance. Next question. Does warning through email is accepted? Yes. So if we're talking about the initial communication where you need to highlight gaps and provide warning, a summary through email is accepted as evidence for documentation. Is it advisable to conduct PIP because of attendance issue? Now, this would depend. It's a very tricky angle. Is the attendance issue causing productivity issues? Or what is the cause of attendance issue? Is it sick leave, or is it annual leave or unpaid leave? If it's frequent sick leave and medical leave, I would say that will be managed in a different area. If attendance issue is absenteeism, I would recommend that to be a misconduct issue. However, if it's attendance issues like annual leave and lateness or things like that, I would not necessarily put it on a PIP because it is not a skill. It is not a gaps in performance. Attendance issues usually can be managed under a misconduct route, but you can do a PIP if it's affecting the productivity. So for example, the core issue is attendance, but because of attendance, I don't meet my 10 quotations a month, for example. So your PIP will be based on not reaching the target of 10 quotations a month rather than attendance. Because if, let's say, I come to work every single day of the month, does that affect the productivity? So your PIP, your performance should be more on productivity based on KPI rather than attendance issues, which can be managed in different routes. Next question. Can a PIP conducted for attendance issue, example, frequently take medical leave or unpaid leave? As I said earlier, it is not recommended. Again, because what would your measurable goals be? Number one. Number two, there are different ways to manage frequently sick leave or unpaid leave. And number three, how does it affect the skill and productivity? So when it comes to attendance issues, my recommendation would be to manage it differently, whether it's misconduct or any kind of other management. But for performance issue, focus on the productivity. Means what are they lacking in performance? Are they reaching their KPIs? What is the two different things between those two? And focus the PIP on that. What if we have done counseling with the staff on his lateness, and after more than 6 months only, we proceed with verbal warning again? Is it okay to do so? Do we need to do again with counseling? So this is more on a misconduct, but if you have done counseling and proceed with verbal warning, I would say always document it. Verbal warning can be done, but if you're looking at 6 months and the staff is consistently late and you don't have a lot of documentation to prove that it was warned before, when you do your misconduct, you're also looking at things like condonation, which means that you allowed it to happen and the company can't then take disciplinary action after a period of time. So if you want a more lenient way, you can do it with counseling, but my advice would be if it's going on for a long period of time, start having a more firmer action in managing the lateness. Next question. I have a situation involving an employee who is currently under a PIP. Recently, he wrote an email to our MD lodging a grievance regarding management practices, the workplace environment, and HR's handling of the performance improvement process. Can we initiate an inquiry with the employee and also conduct interviews with his colleagues? What is the best way to manage the situation? So here I would classify the grievance first, means I would address the grievance first, which would be, what is the grievance? Is the grievance substantiated? Is there proof to what he is alleging? Address it, get it back to the employee, and then after that, continue back with the performance improvement. Another option, if you would really like, can get us to review that whole process to see whether there's any truth in the employee's allegations. Next, should we issue a warning letter after conducting a PIP 3 months and see that there is still no improvement or minimum improvement of performance? So the warning comes first. PIP is usually your last resort for coaching and training. The process would be you identify the gaps, you give the warning first, which can be in the form of a warning letter, counseling, etc., then proceeding with PIP. If the PIP has no improvement or minimum improvement on performance, then you are looking at either an extension of PIP. If there's still no improvement, you can proceed with termination should the company decide to do so, or a demotion or a transfer if they don't pass the PIP. Next. In one department, employees who failed the PIP are always proceeded with termination. However, due to headcount pressure, the department is now considering confirming an employee on PIP who has not met all the KPIs. What would your advice be in this situation? Okay, so if the company's practice is if you don't pass PIP, it's always termination. That is fine. But again, you're balancing performance and even business practicalities and operation needs of the company. So here, if someone who is on PIP but has not met all the KPIs, but you need that headcount, that would depend on the company's prerogative. PIP is a tool to improve performance, not a checklist for termination. So termination is not the automatic next step after PIP. There are other things like transfer, demotion, sometimes even reassignment. But if the company feels that there is some improvement to the PIP, that can then help justify remaining the headcount. So even if, let's say, they have not improved or achieved all the KPIs in the PIP, but they did half of it, quarter of it, and the company decides to give this person a further chance by confirming, that is also perfectly fine. Next question. Hi, what is the difference between a disciplinary action and a performance improvement plan? What type of mistakes or poor performance falls under each category. For example, if I have an operator who makes a mistake while working and it causes a loss to the company, would this situation be handled under PIP or DI? Very good question. DI, a disciplinary action, domestic inquiry, is usually for misconduct. So, for example, when it comes to performance, you don't need to issue a show cause, you don't need to do domestic inquiry. They're two different processes altogether. So, for a disciplinary action, you're looking at issuing a show cause, getting their reply, having evidence to prove the misconduct, and if the employee denies the allegations, you're looking at domestic inquiry. And finally, what is the punishment, which can be warning letters, suspension, termination of employment, or even demotion, right? So that's misconduct. Comparing to a performance improvement plan, where you're talking about performance management route, is that it's more based on KPI. There's based on skills. It's my ability to do the job, which means that it'll go back to what is your KPI, what is your JD? Are there gaps in your performance? How do we improve it? So that's poor performance, means my ability to do the job. So in your example, if you have an operator who makes a mistake while working and it causes a loss to the company, I would say that is a misconduct, negligence, right? Because it happened one time. However, if let's say I have an employee who commonly makes mistakes routinely that affects the operations, and despite me clarifying, despite me saying this is the way you do it, but they don't have the ability to do it that way, then that would be a performance issue, which then warrants a PIP. So it also depends on context. If it's something that happens once, there's negligence and causes loss to the company, I would classify that under misconduct. If it is something that, let's say, an SOP that the employee has to follow, but despite any coaching, despite any guidance, I still can't follow it, then that would be a performance issue. Next question. Task given, no coaching, demand employee self-exploring can be charged PIP. No, that would be, I would say, a normal coaching. A PIP, you would have to issue a PIP notice. You would have to have a document that highlights, like I said, the gaps, what they need to achieve, the timeline, when is the review supposed to be done, and what are the consequences for it to be considered a PIP. Next. If we go for demotion, will the salary remain? Only the position change? Yes, that can be done. However, if you go for demotion post PIP, where the salary has to be adjusted to the new grade, that is doable. So either way, it's fine. If the company wants to demote but still remain the original salary, that is also fine as well. Okay, so I think that was the last of the questions. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time and your attention. If you have further questions, please do. Oh, sorry, there's the last question. We'll do that before we end. I have an employee who works with us for 15 years, but for the past 2 years, the performance is dropping drastically. If after we do PIP, say for 3 to 6 months, and the performance still does not meet requirement, can we terminate? Just based on this information, yes, you can. But I would look into what are the documents you have, what kind of drop in performance are we talking about, and what is the risk, because it's a long-serving employee. What was the performance like before these 2 years? Are there any other root causes to it? Feel free to connect with me. We can discuss this on a more deeper basis. Then at least I can give you better guidance should you need it. Okay. So thank you very much once again, everybody, for your time. Feel free, if you have any more questions, please drop us an email at our general line or to any one of our consultants. We'll be more than happy to help you out. I hope everyone had a good session and we'll meet again next time. Thank you.